Let's do this. Okay, so before we get started, I have to do the essentials. Turn off noisemakers, especially beepers. If you have one of those, just chuck it outside, because that is just a problem. Anyways, you'll also be getting evals at the end. Excellent is recommended. Good is okay, but definitely excellent is what we ask you to give. So let me introduce myself first. I'm Grant Shonkwiler, as you can see, commander in Shonk at Shonk Ventures, because when you start your own company, you can make up your title, so that's pretty cool. I'll be your moderator and timekeeper, which you don't have to worry about the timekeeper. That's more for them. Before Garth gets started here, though, I wanted to introduce the talk. And it is a talk. It kind of looks like a panel, kind of looks like micro talks, whatever. But really, it's one cohesive story told by 4 different people, these amazing people right here. And you may have read this, you may have seen this in the guide, or hopefully you read it, that this is more about the feel portion of being a producer. You know, we all know about Agile and Scrum and Kanban and all those things. But what we wanted to talk about is the feel portion, the soft skills of being a producer, the one-on-one relationships that you have with the people on your team. So that's what we're going to get into today. Oops. Go slide. This is that awkward part. Okay. But we are producers, right? So we need to have some sort of agenda for our meeting, talk today. So Garth's going to come up first. He's going to talk about For the Love of the Video Game. Oksana will then talk about building team culture. Charles will talk about creating thriving teams. And then Bryan will close us out with conflict in the workplace. So yeah, I'm going to introduce everybody and then get ready. There's an interactive portion of this, so don't fall asleep. I know it's Thursday. Just stay ready. So let me introduce Garth first. He is a senior producer at Firaxis Games, overseeing the XCOM franchise since 2010. He began his career in design on XCOM Enemy Unknown and an IGF student prototype called Winds of Orbis. In a previous life, he was a VP at a large financial institution before pursuing his Master's of Entertainment Technology at Carnegie Mellon. Garth was instrumental in coming up with the format and session idea for this a few years ago, but wasn't able to make it because he's working on a little game called XCOM 2. So we're super happy to have him here this year. All right, Garth, take it away.
Hello, everyone. So yes, we're going to talk about trust mechanics. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about the harder part of our job, which is the soft skills. So this will not be a talk about Agile, Waterfall, Scrum, Kanban, Lean, Six Sigma, or any other hybrid approach that I'm sure you guys are using in some form on your projects right now. But there is no silver bullet, as evidenced by our repeated post-mortem mistakes that we all share with each other. So process is important. I want to make that clear. But what if, when it comes to enabling a culture for a team to find success, we've been focusing a little bit too much on the wrong area? This is a quote from Pixar President Ed Catmull. He's created a few hits that I'm sure you guys are aware of from his book, Creativity, Inc. You can't manage what you can't measure is a maxim that is taught and believed by many in both the business and education sectors. But in fact, the phrase is ridiculous. Something said by people who are unaware of how much is hidden. A large portion of what we manage can't be measured, and not realizing this has unintended consequences. Now, I love this quote, but I would not recommend you guys bringing this to your boss if you need more time on your project. But there's a snippet in this quote that is critical. It's being unaware of how much is hidden. So after choosing a process that makes sense for your team, then the trickier part begins. You have to have an acute awareness of your team's dynamics to empower them to uncover the hidden within this vast, dark cave when you start your project. Usually the magic in a project is in all the nooks and crannies, and you have to help enable them to find a light. So how do we do it? I have no idea on XCOM. I really don't. But I can give you two very simple key takeaways that stayed true throughout XCOM, and also keeping them upheld throughout the project as well is part of it. And those two keys are trust and love. Now, you guys all came to the video game industry probably because you have your own love story with this awesome interactive medium when you were young. So that's to me is the easier part. But the trust is more what I wanted to focus on. And when I was sort of given the opportunity to go from level design and sort of this junior production role into lead producer, the very first thing I wanted to do was sit down with each of the leads and ask them simply, how can I make your job easier? I didn't want to prescribe anything to them. And frankly, I couldn't, because I wanted to learn from these very awesome senior guys. But I think that helped set a tone with them that this is an environment where I want to support you, and I want to have an ongoing relationship with you guys to have an environment where we can find success together. So the trust mechanics are not something that I knew about when I started out on this franchise back in 2009, But looking back in it, sort of in retrospect, our process has changed a lot. Those process elements that I spouted off at the beginning of this, we've tried little tidbits of each of those. We've tried, poker planning and agile fall and anything you can think of, and we're still experimenting today. That's always going to change as you talk to your team. But there's a few elements that have stayed true throughout XCOM's production. And I sort of see this as a machination. These are gears and cogs that work together in the different elements. You want to love the vision, love your support structure, and hear your community. So we'll talk about each one of these a little bit. If you do these things, I think success and it will follow. Of course, you need individual hard work, but these are the dynamics holding the team together. So trust mechanic number one, love the vision. You guys all know what a vision is. You must have a vision. Our vision, like most, took some time to find. This is our shell screen, I believe in 2007, 2008, with one of our early gameplay prototypes. And if you guys went to my art director's talk on Monday, Greg Furch, he did a really, really great deep dive on this initiative that he and the lead designer worked with 10 artists before they had any engineers to sort of find what the gameplay of XCOM Enemy Unknown would be. Greg, I apologize for this screenshot if you're here. I didn't get that approved by you, but I'm trying to make a point that the vision can be murky up front sometimes. If you look on paper, this looked like a really poor production initiative. We're sinking dozens of man-months into something that we know is not going to ship. But what in fact it allowed them to do was to make mistakes early and to uncover the hidden, to start finding things. So the fog of war change, the visibility system, the camera logic, how the soldiers worked with the UI and the action points, all of these things were found in a relatively cost-effective way up front that would have been catastrophic on the back end, and it allowed the team to sort of find their way. As we rolled on into production, these are two screenshots of our glam cams, and we took elements from that gameplay pre-visualization and actually executed on them in the game. You would think once that vision starts getting found, then intuitively it's easy to maintain, but you always have to keep that trust between disciplines going because you're gonna have some problems when actual implementation happens, where it's not as beautiful as that gameplay previs. And the rubber met the road quite a bit. We often fell back on a studio-wide mantra when we were having conflict between disciplines that, I say conflict, but they work so well together because they understood what was driving our community. At Firaxis, for all our projects, we think gameplay first, or gameplay experience first. One of our pillars on XCOM 2 that Greg and the art team drove was making a strategy game feel more action-oriented. But when that presentation layer started stomping on the gameplay mechanics and the understandability of the depth of our mechanics and the interesting decisions and what was happening, which is what our community wants, then he was able to work with design and find that happy middle ground. So the second mechanic is a multi-cog approach. This is love your support structure. And I say support structure because you have your team, which everyone knows about, but then you also have your external partners. And that can be an investor, that can be a publisher. And I think it can really be understated that you want to have a very strong relationship with the people funding your vision. We're very lucky to have a relationship with 2K Games, and it started out on an excellent footing because they believed in a turn-based strategy game and giving it AAA support. Which is critical. And then day to day, we have had a completely transparent relationship with them when design changes are happening, when they need to see where we're at with the schedule. I often hear stories from colleagues in the industry where their instinct is to hide information from an external partner, and they're doing that to protect the team. But to me, that's indicative of a longer-term problem where you want to have an open, transparent relationship and make them understand the reality of game development, and 2K has been phenomenal with that. So the next cog is your team, and this can be sort of its own presentation, but we don't have a ton of time. So these are the guys and gals that execute on the vision, and I wanted to just show a few pictures. Before I joined Firaxis, I was at Carnegie Mellon, like Grant said, and our advisor, Jesse Schell, would often say, the success of a student project could be reflected in their joy and their interaction in a candid photo. He said there was a direct correlation between that and then a project team that looked like they didn't want to work together. And we made this roughshod, terrible student prototype that blossomed into an IGF winner. And you can see, we really enjoy working together. We still go to this picture every year and talk about, hey, we need to reunite. There was a lot of trust and love between us, and we wanted to get each other's backs. We were terrified of letting each other down. And I'm lucky to sort of have that microcosm from CMU and see that blown to a studio-wide culture at Firaxis, where every single project, there is this high standard, and we have teammates that don't want to let each other down. These are pictures from the team back in the mid-2000s, and all these folks are still with the company. I think we have over a 60% attrition rate on the XCOM team from when inception over a decade ago, which is great in any industry, let alone game development, and it's really indicative of the culture that we have there. Sometimes conflict happens, but hey, You gotta tough love your teammates once in a while. So not everything is always gonna be hunky-dory. Of course, you'll have team members get lost, and they'll lose sight of the vision, and it's the producer's job to champion that and get them back on track. That happened often on Enemy Unknown, and we did some non-publisher-driven milestones to get levels back on track. And then we parlayed concepts like that into XCOM 2 with this idea of goalposts. It's essentially epics in producer speak, but what we did was we made them very, very visible and transparent. We laid out over the course, sorry about that, of multiple years on our War Room whiteboard what the content team was gonna drive towards. And not only did they hit it, but they exceeded it. We actually shipped an entirely new environment set than what we had planned. And we got a lot of feedback from them after the fact that they liked how visible these were and that these weren't buried away in some backlog that only a few producers would see. So it was really a good initiative. It didn't work as well for design and tech because the acceptance criteria there is a lot more murky and nebulous and prone to change. So we had one-off design cabals with them to help them find their way, to have more actionable items quicker. And then we would grow those into playthroughs, which I would highly recommend using. You have to use them conservatively though, because there's key times in the schedule where it's appropriate to use them as all the systems are converging and all the content's coming in. It's gonna be buggy and messy as hell up front. And you want that team to feel a little bit of that pain, so then you can see day over day it improves and you guys sort of uncover the hidden together and find the fun. Okay, I'm gonna make this a little bit shorter, but this is a topic I'm really passionate about. Crunch is big in the industry as producers and the owners of the time were responsible for the outcome of that if you do crunch. XCOM put in a lot of extra hours, and I'm not gonna say we didn't crunch, but we did want to respect what drives others. I've talked a lot about vision execution, and I think those are the most important thing, but they shouldn't come at the cost of spitting your team out for dead. You have to be aware of the team health and figure out how to manage that. We had some ways of doing that. I'll be happy to talk about with people afterwards where we had sort of a tailored extra hour approach where we got the buy-in from individuals after we balance loaded. We made them aware of the why we were asking for more work and managed it that way. So the last trust mechanic is community, and community is everything. They're your pillar beneficiary, the recipient of everything that you've worked to build, and you want to maintain a relationship with them after you ship, especially in this day and age now too, where there's more ways to communicate with them. You want that community to grow. But if you notice I say hear your community and not listen to your community, it's very, very easy to design by community, and we want that information. After Enemy Unknown, we actually aggregated all of their feedback that was trending on the top forums and the top reviews, and we made design aware of that feedback, but it did not drive our design pillars for XCOM 2. It was just part of the informational process. So these are XCOM's trust mechanics. Love the vision, love your support structure, and hear your community. These are ultimately what allowed us to light up our cave with 1,000 bonfires. How will you light yours? Thank you.
Thank you, Garth. Thank you. All right, so we're going to do something that may be a little awkward for some of you. This comes from Scott Crabtree. By the way, he has a talk tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I recommend you go to because he is amazing. Nice plug. Okay, so if you're willing and able, please stand up. That's now. This is the part where you stand up. I know it's Thursday. If this was Friday, I would not ask you to stand up. Find your nearest partner and talk for 30 seconds each about what you just learned from that from Garth's talk. That was excellent.
Thanks, man.
Let's do the thing with your hands where you're talking. Last year, the photographer came in during this part, and we got amazing pictures because we're all like.
Thanks. Yeah, I noticed it. I was going to go, I plan to go.
All right. Everyone sit back down. Don't worry. Stop talking. You in the back. Time's up. Don't worry, you'll get to talk to each other more, I promise. And now you have new friends. You can go to the bar later and talk about this even more. I promise there will be more time to talk. But next up, we have Oksana. She's going to talk to you about oh, that was the wrong thing to say. Anyways, she is the development director at Riot Games, heading up the platform group. She has 10 years of experience in the industry as an engineer and 5 years in production, so she made a pretty cool switch. So, Oksana?
Hi, guys. Whoa. Thank you. Hi. Wow, awesome. I love this. All right, so I'll be talking about high-performance team culture, and I'll give you 4 tips today. These are the tips that actually come from my own experience, something that worked for me in the past. I find those to be very easy to understand, but very effective. And so I'll jump right in. And the first tip of the day is start with the why. When we talk about high performance on teams, we usually talk about motivation. So what drives motivation? What drives people to perform highly? And it's an interesting question. I remember when I was interviewing at Microsoft about 5 years ago, I think, the interviewer asked me, how do you motivate teams through crunch time? And I was just switching to production at the time, and I thought about it, and I'm like, well, I buy pizza and donuts, and I hope they feel better about it. So my interview didn't go well. But my thinking evolved since then, and so I read the book by Daniel Pink about drive. And in that book, he says there are 3 primary motivators, 3 primary drivers for motivation. And it's purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And so the sense of purpose is probably the strongest way to motivate people. And the way I mean this is when you have a team comprised of individuals whose sense of their own internal purpose is aligned with your why for the team, it's a very powerful combination. I'll give you an example of how this works on my team. I'm heading a platform team. And we're doing stuff that's generally considered not very sexy. I personally think it's sexy, but it's like installers, patchers, servers, localization, all this stuff that is not the actual game development. And so when I try to motivate people to work on my team, it sometimes is hard. But I have this guy on my team, his name is Michael. And I talked to him about why he works on my team, and he gave me this story. He actually used to be a teacher, and he one day noticed a kid in his class. The kid was super unhappy. He was very shy, very nobody would even talk to the kid. And Michael decided to help him. So he sat down with the kid, and for the next couple of weeks, he showed him how to make a game. So they made this little game together, and then this kid brought it and showed it to the classmates. Overnight, he became from a total pariah, somebody who nobody would even talk to the most popular kid in the class. And so Michael changed this kid's life by helping him with making this game. And so when Michael works on a platform team, he actually does that for other people, help them focus on building the game and creative side of it by taking all of this other stuff away. And he does that because it aligns with his own sense of purpose, what gives him fulfillment. So I don't have to buy him donuts to convince him to go and work hard on my team. He does that because he wants to. So that's the tip number 1. Start with the why. Make sure you have a very clearly articulated why for your team, but then make sure that your people on your team actually align with that sense of why. So that's number 1. Number 2, define success. A while back, my boss gave me a book. It was called something like On Leadership, How to Build Successful Organizations, and it was written by this guy. How many of you know who this guy is? Okay, a few. So this is a basketball coach. At the time, I looked at the book, and I'm like, I don't want to read this. I'm not into sports. Why would I even read this? So I looked him up. So this is Coach Wooden of UCLA basketball. And this guy, his team won 88 consecutive games, 88 in a row. So it's win after win after win after win, continuously, nonstop. He won 10 national championships in 12 years, with a record 7 in a row. Previous record is 2 in a row. So if anyone knows about performance, is this guy. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to read this book. And in this book, he defines success like this. So I'm going to read it because it's very important. I know you all can read, but I'm going to read it anyways. Success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you did your best to become the best you're capable of becoming. So understanding this had a profound effect on how I motivate my teams and how I set the goals for them. It's very easy to set the goals that are like external KPIs or metrics or targets. Your game must perform to a certain Metacritic score, or you must ship by a certain date. When you motivate people by those external kind of outcomes, they don't necessarily have control over that. And so it may drive like wrong kind of behaviors. I don't know if you guys know about Wells Fargo recently fired like 5,000 people because they were creating all these shadow accounts because their KPI was how many accounts they sell in a given time frame. So you don't want that kind of behavior. What you want is your teams to continuously and relentlessly compete against themselves. One of the probably most weird conversations I had at Riot when I joined, when we were talking about releasing some feature, and I said, well, we should look up how the competitors do it. And the guys look at me like, competitors? We don't compete against people. We're actually focusing on trying to do the best thing for the player right now. And so that just blew my mind. But that's a really good way to motivate teams to focus on continuously improving and competing against themselves. And so my tip number 2. The tip number 3, we talked a little bit about trust. We all know that there is no high performance without trust, right? And in fact, Patrick Lencioni, in his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, says that absence of trust is probably the most foundational, the most common dysfunction on a team. By the way, if you haven't read this book, please go read it. It's a foundational must-read for every producer out there. But building trust, it's easy to say, like, of course we've got to build trust, but what does it mean? Like, it's a hard thing to do. And I'm here to tell you it's not a hard thing to do. I'm an engineer. I love formulas. I'm going to give you a super simple formula to build trust on a team. You ready? Yes?
Yes.
Yes? Yes, okay. There you go. Done, boom. So, trust equation. Trust is credibility, reliability, intimacy over self-orientation. Credibility is you have the experience and the knowledge about what you're talking about, so I can trust you on a subject. Reliability is I can trust you to do what you say you're going to do. Intimacy is I can trust you with my secrets and that you're not going to tell somebody else about these secrets or you're going to kind of use them against me. But all of that is trumped by self-orientation. If I for a second believe that you're acting in your own interest and not in mine, I will not trust you, no matter how credible, how reliable, or how trustworthy you are. I will not trust you. And this works, this is a super powerful formula that works from a team, individual level, all the way to organizations. On the team level, it works like this. It looks like this. An engineer goes, hey, I really like this system. I really love this system and I want to work on this, but my team needs me to focus here. So I'm going to put this down, my pet project, my love child, and I'm going to focus on what my team needs me to do right now. And so he's sacrificing his own self-interest for the interest of the team. And then when other people see that, they start doing the same thing, and the next thing you know, magic happens. And the same thing works all the way on organizational level. So at Riot, we made this our fundamental principle. The mission of the entire company is to aspire to be the most player-focused company in the world. And that means that we have players' trust because no matter mistakes, and we make a lot of mistakes, but the mistakes we make, players know and forgive us because they think and they know that we have their interest at heart first and foremost. And that has to be genuine too. So that was my tip number 3. My tip number 4, and the final tip, is distort reality, just a little bit. What does this mean? You know this guy is pretty famous for distortion of reality. But what I mean here is it's going back to that sense of trust. It's when you walk on a team and you want to build this high-performance culture, you don't go and tell them, hey guys, we're going to be a high-performing team, so let's all focus and do this. Instead, what you want to do is you want to act and talk as if they're already there. You pretend, but then you believe in your mind deeply that your people are the best people you have, that they're bright, that they're brilliant, and they can and will get there. And then you just talk to them that way. There's this very funny kind of experiment that was done. I was really surprised by the outcomes of this. So they took a set of threads, same kind of threads, and they separated into 2 sets. And they gave one set to one set of experimenters and the other set to another. Said, these threads are stupid, these threads are smart. And they had them run the rats through a labyrinth and measure how fast the rats would finish. The people who believe their rats are smart actually had much better results than the people who believe their rats are stupid. Same type of rats. It's so weird. And so they looked into it, and it turns out that people who believe their rats are smart, they actually treated them a little bit with more TLC. They gave them little snacks, they encouraged them a little bit more, they petted them. And so rats perform better. Like, holy shit. And now, if that's how it works for rats, imagine what it does for people. When you genuinely believe in your people, just imagine the results you can accomplish. And that's the distortion of reality. And so this is the recommended list that some of the books that I used in this talk. But before I go, I want to use the distortion of reality on you guys. Okay, are you ready? Okay, everybody's taking pictures. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to use the distortion of reality on you. In this audience, we are all, of course, the type of people that fill out GDC surveys. So when we walk out of here, when we receive our results back, we will have 100% completion rate. Yes? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Well, my friends, it's come to that time again. Clearly, you all enjoyed this. So once again, stand up and chat about what you've learned from Oksana. That was awesome. No, it was amazing.
We'll get bone next time. Not great. We should. Yeah. We can even almost do it like a satire. Yeah. That would be interesting.
I realized I forgot one thing. I should have had you all give me 3 points and a funny point. Because we did the Pechakucha stuff on Monday, and we had where you're from, like what your hobbies are outside of games, and something that your like high school friend would be amazed to know about you. And I heard like the most ridiculous things. One guy was like, I sew better than my wife. Another guy was like, I dropped out of high school, have a GED. Yeah, it's amazing.
Thank you. Thanks.
We're really good on.
How are you feeling physically?
Really good
hanging in there?
So you're 20. We're at about 28 minutes. So about a half hour.
That's good.
All right. In the back of the room. All right. Calm down, you crazy animals. Thank you. Maybe I should announce La La Land as a winner. Maybe that'll get everybody's attention. All right, cool. Up next is Chuck. He is the CPO of Shell Games. He can tell you what CPO means. It sounds fancy. His background is in architecture. He worked on Sims 2 EP team, and now works on theme park attractions such as Disney Toy Story Mania, which I got a high score on, just saying. To cutting edge VR and AR such as I Expect You to Die. Also, he is an adjunct faculty at CMU teaching production and leadership. All right, Chuck.
I like finding sage wisdom inside of Jira. I like this one. Yeah, well said, Atlassian. So I've been making games for a while, or what feels like a long time anyway. I've worked on dozens and dozens of games, and I've seen a lot of them do really well and succeed, and I've seen a lot of them crash and burn. And I'm sure most of you in this room have gone through those observations on different projects you've worked on or projects you've seen out there. And after a while, you start trying to figure out what the difference is between those really successful teams and the ones that fail, what the impact is that informs how those teams are going to do. So what I want to talk about today a little bit is teams that thrive and kind of our quest at Shell Games to figure out what enabled those teams to thrive when others didn't, and trying to replicate an environment to have very successful teams. So I actually had a hypothesis going into this a few years ago. And the first was that very successful teams had much higher morale, were happier with their vision, believed in their project more, and were generally happier working together. And certainly, when I say that, I mean all else being equal, right? There's plenty of things outside the team that contribute to the success or failure of a game that sometimes you don't have control over. But when we look just at the teams, I certainly posited that happier teams did better work. And I had a second theory that most of the teams that we experience in the game industry have a very similar curve of morale over time. Maybe something like this, where we start off really early at the beginning and there's tons of potential. We have the world in front of us. We have a prototype that feels really good. And then the reality starts setting in about what we have to build and all the crap we don't know about. And it gets really scary. But then we get really good at focusing in on our scope and the possibility space narrows in. And morale starts to lift back up. And you get to a really good spot and things start come together and you ship your game and you feel really good about it. And I'm sure there's slight differences in this, but I really felt like over time, a lot of projects followed this same curve. And I kind of wondered if we could map this curve, if we knew this existed for multiple projects, as a studio, can we head it off at the pass? Can we anticipate these dips and valleys so that we continue to boost the morale of the teams from the studio's perspective, so that we can reduce the impact of these valleys? So we did an experiment. And for 2 years, every 3 weeks, I sent a survey to about 12 teams in our studio, and I asked 3 big questions. The first was to rate your project's chance for success. Then we asked people to rate your overall satisfaction at that given day. And then we asked people to select any number of emotional indicators that they wanted. And this is the graph we used. So on the vertical up and down are positive or negative emotions, and from left and right is kind of the intensity of these emotions. And people could go through and pick and choose. So I'm going to show you if I can get the mouse over here, maybe. Yeah, all right. I'm going to show you what that looks like over time. So while this is playing, I'll just explain it. This is just a subset of the data, but here's some examples of 4 or 5 teams. The vertical axis is their satisfaction on the project. Horizontal is over time, so there's a motion graph showing the duration of these projects. And actually the size of the sphere in this example is related to the joyful quadrant of those emotional indicators. So we got a lot of data over 2 years. So what did that show us? Well, not a ton. It wasn't actually that useful. The first thing, our first hypothesis, did seem to be correct. When we look back at our teams, we saw ones that were consistently higher in morale over the lifetime of their project were generally more successful. So that was cool. That was kind of useful. But man, there was no relationship with teams. That fictional curve did not seem to be replicated across different projects in any way. It was really shocking how little projects looked like each other. And what was kind of crazier is they didn't even seem to map to big points in the project. It wasn't like, oh, we had a big cut in scope here, or a big shift in decisions here, or priority changes from the client. It was like teams with really high morale were consistently pretty high, and they kind of ebbed and flowed seemingly randomly, and teams that were lower kind of did the same thing. So a lot of our realization from this was, we could look at the team's morale, we could track it, but any interventions we tried weren't super useful or impactful on that morale over time. And we realized that, team morale and happiness wasn't something that we could impose on the team. It was something that really needed to come from the heart of the team, from its people. I like how we all randomly picked like 4 lessons for everybody to learn. We're all producers here. I always love this quote by Peter Drucker, right, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And when we looked at teams that really thrived at our studio, it wasn't because of process or schedule or best practices. It was kind of these cultural norms on the team, and not just the team leadership, but the entire team. And when we tried to replicate those, we really looked at the teams that were doing really well, and we found kind of these 4 common cultural traits for these thriving teams. So I'm going to share those next and some concrete steps about how you can maybe apply those to your teams. So the first that we noticed was our thriving teams were really ones that were willing to buy into a decision fully and then just move on. So one of the strategies we saw time and time again is people on these teams were willing to be convinced of different points of view, but more so than that, they would tell each other specifically what would change their mind, right? If Garth and I are in a disagreement, it's one thing to acknowledge that I have a particular viewpoint, but these teams elevated that and were actually open with each other about, yeah, I don't agree with you, but here's some things that would get me to agree with you. And these may be big things, right? It may be building a prototype, it may be answering really challenging questions, it may be data or information that you don't have. But going through this process made it really clear to people on the team that there was a culture of being open to changing your mind, and people were very willing to be convinced. The second kind of almost powerful phrase we saw these teams reference a lot is one called disagree and commit. And these were teams that were really focused on building consensus. Like, that was very important for them. But on larger and larger teams, these teams acknowledge that that's not always possible. You don't always get everyone on the same page. And that's kind of fine, that's normal, but we saw teams that were much more successful focus in on, if you can't build consensus, at least commit to the group, commit to the team. And by doing that, a lot of times they were able to eliminate a lot of the, well, I told you so, right, out there in the future, or people sabotaging the team because they didn't feel like they ever bought into the decision. So people that were willing to acknowledge and say their disagreement, but then commit to each other as a team, were much more powerful teams. So the second cultural attribute we noticed a lot was the teams had really good strategies for cutting through complexity. So just as an example here, this is a what we call a propaganda poster that these teams use in our studio. And this was for our recent VR title, I Expect You to Die. And lots of people use things like vision statements and pillars. But when we saw teams that were really good at cutting through complex decisions and understanding how to simplify down to what was really important, these were teams that would essentially actively market their vision in their team. They wouldn't just write it in a Google Doc or bury it on Perforce. They would make posters. They would hang them up in the team areas. Right? This became a marketing or propaganda effort for them to get everyone bought into that vision, which allowed a lot of really strong conversations of just, we have a lot of complex options in front of us, but how does that match up to our game pillar? Another really powerful phrase we noticed a lot was the term, or the sentence basically, what problem are we trying to solve? And Oksana mentioned earlier, starting with the why is really critical. And we found this as a really useful tool, and teams leverage this a lot on really successful team cultures, because it kind of cuts through a lot of the complexity to focus on the actual core of the problem you're trying to address. And a lot of times that problem isn't obvious, may have not been agreed to, or is really challenging to get to. But teams that were able to use this phrase were able to kind of get down to the meat of the conversation, get everyone on the same page with the problem we're trying to solve, and it was much easier to move people through solution spaces. So our third one here are really, our teams that were most successful were willing to be very vulnerable. And part of this involved them not punishing mistakes. And one side of this coin, right, is being willing to admit your own mistakes or screw-ups. But that set a lot of a strong team culture as an example to the rest of the team that mistakes were okay. People were willing to hear them. They were willing to be vulnerable in front of each other. Because guess what? If you punish mistakes, it's not like they go away. You just don't hear about them anymore because people are afraid to tell you. Another thing these teams did in their culture was a lot of transparency, which a few people have mentioned already today. And I remember actually from my background in architecture, a lot of architects build houses with like these giant-ass glass windows, right? And people always think it's for the view or for the light in the house. But really, architects do that because you'll keep your house cleaner. It changes the culture in your house to be transparent. If anybody's familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright, I remember one of his philosophies. He'd do a lot of houses for clients, and he would refuse to put garage doors on garages. He would only make carports because he knew if he put garage doors on there, people would just fill their garages with crap. And he didn't want people to do that. He wanted them to have simpler, cleaner lives. So he would build in transparency into their homes, even if they didn't want it. So it's kind of interesting to think about. I think a lot of folks view transparency on their team as something they need to navigate or negotiate either with their clients or partners or within their organization. But transparency on your team can actually be a real benefit or transformation for the culture on your own team. And last, number 4, folks on these teams were excellent at resolving conflicts, but man, the thing that stuck out was how swift and rapid they were able to do this. When we look at the best examples of this on teams, these are people who are resolving conflicts within minutes of them happening, not hours or days or weeks. So they had essentially zero hesitation in approaching each other to resolve conflicts. And I'll share another kind of key or powerful phrase, and this one's kind of funny. This actually circulates around our studio and has been kind of a key phrase at Shell Games for a long time. And really, in my mind, it goes back to valuing the understanding of other people over just being right. And that phrase is, tell me more about that. And we've kind of built a strong culture around people using that phrase when they disagree with someone or when someone says something that they immediately recoil against. And it's kind of funny about 3 weeks ago, we were sitting in a meeting and someone said this to someone else, and Jesse Shell, our CEO and founder, started laughing in the corner of the room. We're like, what's so funny? And he's like, I don't think you guys realize where I stole that from. He got that from a chatbot named Eliza that came out in 1966. And Eliza had such poor AI that she wouldn't really function well when you chat with her. So to kind of trick people around this, they found a phrase where if Eliza didn't understand what you were saying, she would simply write back, tell me more about that. And it's kind of stupid, but it's an incredibly powerful phrase because it does two things, right? It signals to the other person that you really value understanding them. And to yourself, it reminds you that there's a lot more to understand to get to the why, to get to the real understanding of why someone is bringing something up. So it kind of lowers your initial, if your gut reaction isn't defense or countering someone's argument, but it's let me hear more about what you're trying to get across. Man, people don't change until they feel heard. And this is a good kind of powerful phrase to remind you to hear other people. So everything we talked about today in terms of teams that thrive and teams that are successful and teams that have really high morale, all of this from our observations boiled down to essentially how people treated each other on the team. Success was never based on a strategy or a process. It always ended up being part of the culture, and that culture needed to be built bit by every single person on the team. And if you haven't noticed already, those 4 items we just talked about, those aren't things that your team can do. Those are things that you can do. Because culture may eat strategy for breakfast, but you get to make the culture. So while you're here at GDC, I would certainly challenge everybody not to get too swept up in focusing on how to improve your teams. Focus on improving yourself. Be the best example of what you want your team to be. Be an exemplar for them. That's where your best value is going to be, and that's going to give you the best chance of making a thriving team. Thanks.
All right, stand up. We're going to do something a little different this time. So last year, stand up still. You still have to stand up. So last year's version of this talk, the prequel, if you will, Michelle Ducker talked about stress and dealing with stress. And one of her ways of dealing with it is to scream. And I like to do this because it really messes with the people on both sides of us. So what I want you to do is I want you to take just a few seconds, close your eyes, and think about what makes you stressed this week, what makes you stressed at work, the things that you're kind of thinking about now instead of just being present and being part of this. And then on the count of 3, we're all going to scream as loud as we can and get that out, okay? Ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Ah! Perfect. Okay, now do the normal thing, turn and talk to each other for a few seconds, and we'll get that going.
The thing I'm stressed about is this.
You have 15 minutes. Don't take 15 minutes.
Ish. I don't, actually.
Don't take 15 minutes, but you have 15.
I will not take 15.
someone produced this
Well done, Grant.
and
I mean,
created
you're
a
right.
story, a narrative, if you will.
You're right, it's almost like that. Not quite.
All right, all right. One more to go, and then you can talk in the hallways forever. You can spend as much time getting to know each other as you want. All right, all right. I just want to like McConaughey. All right, all right, all right. People in the back, everybody in front of you is sat down. That is the indicator that we are ready to move on with our lives. All right, last one. Here we go. Bryan over here is game director at Backflip Studios. They're based in Boulder, Colorado. He constantly is going to Red Rock and sending me pictures and making me angry. He's worked on a bunch of games, Paper Toss, which is one of my favorite, Ninjump, Ragdoll Blaster franchise, along with Dragonvale, and his personal favorite, Army of Darkness Defense. All right, Bryan.
What I just screamed about was this moment. What are you most stressed about? About 12 seconds from now. So forgive me for being a little raspy. In my lifetime, I've been an algebra teacher, a wrestling coach, I was a bartender, I was a pastor. That didn't stick. I was the lead singer in an 80s cover band, which is what that picture is. I'm not crying or hungry, I'm singing. And this kind of crooked path through a bunch of different jobs and careers and weird things has helped me realize that no matter the job, no matter the scenario, whether it's a sophomore who's retaking algebra because he failed it once already and hates you on day one, or maybe it's a really fiery debate about the nature of magic and dragons with your lead artist, being able to communicate in the midst of conflict is a skill that will help you everywhere, always, right? So it is a little difficult talking about soft skills, feely things, and having it not feel like a poster hung in your kitchen in your game studio, like, hang in there. Because it can feel like platitudes, right? What is a concrete thing that we can do from soft skills? And that's why they're called soft skills, not so concrete. But my aim today is to target a few scenarios that you will inevitably find yourself in at different points in your career, provide you some resources. Oksana and I picked one of the same books. Share some examples from my life so that hopefully my failures can enlighten you, or at least you can laugh at me, which is fine. But my intent is not to give you a bunch of crap for motivational posters, although that might end up happening. So I wanted to do, here's some books. These are good. You should read them, except for the third one, because it's not out yet. It comes out in like 2 weeks. But Kim Scott gives a bunch of talks about radical candor. And so the whole point of this is difficult conversations, having to initiate them. It's receiving feedback. The 5 love languages is a bit churchy, as a heads up. But understanding what motivates people, getting to the why, is an important thing. And this does a really good job of understanding what motivates different types of people. And then the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Oksana's right, go read it now. Maybe not right now. So I think it's important, you were talking about, who was talking about this? It was Chuck. Was talking about conflict and how it got resolved quickly. Conflict isn't failure. And this is important to know. Conflict is not failure. If I worked at a place with only clones of myself, first of all, that is damn terrifying. And the beer fridge would be well stocked, though. But I would still have problems. I get mad at myself, arguably more than Goody does. Arguably. Conflict is the surest human interaction with a group of people over time. My own equation is people plus time equals hostility. It's inescapable. And this is also just like a really good lesson to learn. I think a lot of producers, a lot of leaders like to be liked. And it's super important that you just absorb this now. Some people won't like you. and that's okay. We're not for everybody. Everybody's not for us. Some people won't like you. That's all right. I mean, that's not like a badge to go around and be like Captain A-hole firing off all the time. Hey, some people just don't like me. That's not, right? It's not an excuse to run roughshod and be a douche, but I am saying it is okay. Some people won't like you. So here are the 3 types of conflict you will undoubtedly have in your life, work, things, always. When members of your team are not getting along and you have to mediate that. Sometimes people don't like each other. Chuck and Grant, tough to tell sometimes. Sometimes people don't like each other. Or sometimes there is conflict and they're not great at navigating that. Sometimes you have to be the person who initiates a difficult conversation. You have to say something to someone that you are relatively certain is going to be unpopular. And then at some point in your life, you are going to have to be told something you don't love. And knowing how to be able to do that is important. So, how to handle when folks aren't getting along. So, step 1, have them try to do it themselves. I know that sounds lazy, and it sounds a lot like conflict avoidance, and the opposite of what I'm talking about for the next 5 minutes. But if you can trust them to figure it out themselves, trust them to be adults, I think you guys can figure this out. You girls, you can figure it out, right? But you have to monitor the situation, otherwise that actually is just laziness. Because what happens in a lot of conflict is one person feels fine. I have been heard, I feel fine. And the other person, not fine. And if you ask somebody, hey, how are you doing? Fine. How are you doing? Not fine. You gotta be able to manage and understand that. So what I try to do is bring people together. I put them in the same room and purposefully mediate. My wife's a therapist, so I get lots of practice. She specializes in adolescence, which is how she puts up with me. She married a giant man-child. But what I find when you put people in the same room is their complaints get a little less hyperbolic. It's not, they never listen to me, it's always this way, they treat me like I'm stupid. It's, I kind of don't feel listened to. There's a difference in how people communicate when they face their accuser. But having people in the same room is helpful. And it's also important to know that there's a difference between somebody who needs to vent and when it's time to mediate. Sometimes somebody's just got to be able to come in, close the door, and go, "What the fuck?" That's an important thing that needs to happen sometimes. And then, I think we just got the adult rating, sorry. And then there's a time where you're like, okay, that wasn't just a vent. This is a persistent issue that we're gonna have to handle. So here's a few things that I like to do in these moments. I like to remember that conflict arises out of passion, not apathy. Usually conflict happens because people believe in something and they believe different things and their ideas are problems, right? I loved, tell me more about that. Tell me some more about that. What I'm hearing is, what does that feel like? What does resolution look like to you? What does this, here we are, we have a conflict. What does a solution look like to you? Asking, do you feel like you're being understood? Giving somebody the opportunity to go, no, I'm pretty sure you're just talking. I do that sometimes. And then one of my favorite, it was actually Clint who sent me a list of 31 powerful questions. And one of my favorite ones was, if you could go back and do this over again, what would you do differently? It's a really good way to get somebody to analyze a conflict situation and go, yeah, what would I do differently? And it puts it on them, what could they have done to improve this scenario? So that's step 1. So you have to tell somebody something that you think is going to embarrass them or make them feel bad about themselves. How do you do that in a reasonable way? Maybe that's you have to give like the hygiene talk. Has anybody ever had to give the hygiene talk? And not to like too broad of strokes, but it usually starts with, dude. Not always. Maybe you got to tell somebody on your team that their work isn't meeting the standards that you've set. You're not hitting the bar that we've decided on. There's kind of two scenarios here. Sometimes it's simply helping someone see something they're oblivious to, like lettuce in their teeth. And sometimes it's they'll make an observation about themselves because they've got a sneaking suspicion they're not great. And they will say, I just don't think I'm doing a good job. And a lot of folks are going to try and say, no, you're fine. You're fine. Nope. You have a responsibility, you have a moral obligation as a leader to be able to say, man, I think you might be right. Things don't feel awesome right now. What can I do to help you? You're right. It feels like things are a little off. What can I do to help? I think that's super important. All right. Getting to that time. When you have to receive a message that you don't love, don't just cover your ears. So for me, I'm gonna tell a bit of a personal story. I know we're getting close to the end of the time, and this is helpful because then I won't get emotional about it. I had a tough conversation that stung, and I had a tough time hearing it. I will say it led me to meditation practice, actually, and thank you to Bryan Sharp, who gave a talk about that and really kind of changed my life. But a couple things here. When somebody, these are just kind of very practical things. If somebody tells you something that you don't think you're gonna love, understand the truth, understand their truth, hear what they're hearing, not just what you think. Find the nuggets of truth in that, even if you don't agree with the entire message. Remove the buts, right? You're gonna be like, well, yeah, but it's not about them. It's about you. Take that. So, how to do this quickly. Imagine we paint a picture for you that could be viewed two different ways. You're in a meeting. You're a person who's slightly intimidated by the person leading the meeting. You're a bit quiet. You're worried your feedback's going to get shot down or dismissed. The leader senses that and asks you to speak. You fidget uncomfortably. You stammer. You don't do a good job presenting your idea. The leader presses you again, saying, "It's your job. Speak up." In that moment, you feel vulnerable and a little humiliated. Your leader seems like a bully who cornered you and kind of made you feel dumb. Or, you're the team lead. You're having a discussion about an upcoming release for your game. It's a relatively healthy group discussion, but your designer hasn't chimed in. You ask them for their thoughts. They kind of muddle through it. You push them to clarify. They say they'd prefer not to comment, and you remind them that it is literally their job description to have opinions about this feature. Guess which one I was? In this scenario, without knowing it, I was a total bully, and I didn't know it. I didn't mean to be. I think of myself as a rather gregarious dude. I kind of try to be a little, my wife calls me intensely laid back. I thought I was the pretty girl in this picture. I was not. I goaded someone who was being quiet. I prodded them when they felt intimidated. I didn't allow their truth of intimidation to exist because I didn't mean it. It's like when I was little, my brother would hit me and it hurt. And he's like, "I barely hit you." We were both right. He did barely hit me compared to what he could do, but damn, he's 4.5 years older than me. He's like 6'2" and in the military. He's mean. It hurt. But it wasn't my intention, but my behavior that mattered. And in their moment of vulnerability, I met that with aggression and snark. So I got pulled in by the founder of my company and the HR manager that I was being threatening. Dude, that hurt. And I wanted to make excuses, and I had all the buts, but it's his job, but no. Somebody felt threatened by me. I had to feel the truth of that and think, I'm a fucking bully. And that hurt. But I had to see that truth of it, and I had to understand, and I had to process that because it was important to how I treat people and how I lead now. This was an important thing for me to hear, and I didn't love hearing it. I'm going to leave you with some little snippet to remind myself to not be emotional about this anymore, which is when you get into a position of leadership, the same discussion that you have, the same words with the same person changes context, and you have to be aware of that. I wasn't aware of that, and it's why I was being a bully, essentially. I would be able to have a discussion with somebody and go, that's kind of dumb. Why would we do that? Sometimes that would almost be like a healthy conversation starter when you're peers. Not so much when you're in charge. Hey, that's dumb sounds really dismissive. What do you mean don't do that anyway, but still. So if you have the final say, don't speak first. Thank you.
All right, so we're actually pretty much out of time. I want to thank you all for coming and joining us on the journey of production working on the heart of the team part 2. Maybe there will be a part 3 because you're all going to give us excellent reviews. So thank you for coming. Also, thank you to the awesome CAs in the back, George, Autumn, Chris, William, and for working our shift. And Eric and the rest of the AV crew for providing AV. If you have any questions, we will be around. Thank you very much for coming.